So I played NieR Replicant.
Now I have to say up front that it would be impossible for me to look at this game in a vacuum. It's a remake slash remaster slash whatever they're calling it to the game whose sequel is my favorite game of all time. And it really shows its stripes in that regard. I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit, but maybe we should establish some background first. In 2017, Square Enix and Platinum Games partnered with professional weirdo Yoko Taro to release NieR Automata. Pretty soon, people all over the world were riveted and amazed by 2B's butt. The game was pretty good too. It did well enough that Toy Logic was tapped to do a remake slash remaster slash upgrade version of the game that sort of precedes it. NieR. Specifically, this is NieR Replicant. Long story short, the publisher of the original game suggested Taro make the main character more big macho for Western audiences. He compromised and made two versions of the game, one with a young protagonist and one with a more grizzled main character. Japan got both versions, while the West only got Papa NieR, as he's known. So now we have the hot one. Praise be! Like many people, I played Automata with little regard for the original. To be fair, they take place like 10,000 years apart, but after playing Automata and falling in love with it, I was pretty intrigued by this update version, especially with the new eye candy. The improved graphics, that is. Not only that, but Toy Logic even worked with Platinum to improve the game's combat, which just so happens to be the first segment of the video. In the lead up to release, Toy Logic advertised a combat experience that was closer to Automata. Platinum has a great track record in the combat department, and Automata is no exception. So how does Replicant compare? Well, it's still different, especially from a control scheme perspective, though I personally modified the controls in both cases. Replicant sort of encourages you to make use of different magic abilities by 1. Giving all of them to you over the course of the game, rather than giving you a small handful and leaving you to go find the rest, and 2. Not mapping the standard rapid fire to a dedicated button. That said, I still had a dedicated button for it, and aside from that I stuck to 1 or 2 spells, but most of the spells are pretty stylish and they are pretty useful for the most part. And the melee combat can be fun too. It's not quite on the level of Automata. I kind of missed having 2 weapons at once, and swapping between weapons never quite feels as smooth as I'd like. Aside from that, it's fine. There are some flashy, punchy combos with fun visuals and particle effects. As far as the enemy design, specifically shades, I have to say I'm not crazy about it. There's just not much to latch onto, particularly with the small to mid-sized enemies. Visually, they're mostly just dark figures that are vaguely humanoid, and fighting them, while mostly enjoyable, gets pretty tedious after a while. And you will be playing this game for a while to see it all the way through. Honestly, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the combat because overall I feel it doesn't have a strong emphasis in the game. Compared to Automata, this game seems to have a lower percentage of standard combat gameplay compared to time spent on narrative moments, puzzle elements, and running around endlessly between points of interest. No point in dancing around the comparisons, so we're just gonna dive in. The original NieR very much feels like a beta version of Automata. I say this as someone who never played the original NieR, never mind any of the Drakengard games. From the mechanics to the story structure to the overarching themes, NieR Replicant frequently reminded me of its sequel, and the comparisons were rarely flattering for Replicant. The music, for example. This game has some great music. The composer for both games is the same, but there are a few tracks that you'll be hearing over and over and over and over. Of course, Automata fixed this problem by having variations for each track that kept it fresh throughout the long journey. But wait, you say, there was an issue in a game that was resolved in its sequel? Well, that's what we want, right? No! I'm only kidding. But the fact that the problem was later fixed doesn't erase its existence in Replicant. And I know that the game's budget probably played a big role in some of the problems that I'm going to talk about, but from what I can tell, Automata also didn't have a particularly large budget, and they were still able to make magic. There's also the fact that 2 entirely different developers worked on the 2 games. It's complicated, but we've got a final product, and it's got its charms and it's got its flaws. With that out of the way, let's move on to traversal, the way you move through the world A to B. It's not great. It's not bad either, but it's got its issues. The first thing you'll probably notice is the way that sprinting works. You're given two options if you go into the options menu. You can either let the game decide when you want to sprint, i.e. after you've been running for a few seconds, or you can initiate the sprint yourself with a dodge roll. Now, this isn't something that would cause me to audibly groan or get annoyed, but it's the kind of decision that just makes me tilt my head. Automata functions in basically the same way, the only difference being that the dodge is more of a sidestep. But it just feels weird to have to do a full body roll every single time you want to run faster, especially considering how much traveling you have to do.
Just once I would enjoy receiving a quest that can be sold in the general vicinity of the Asker.
I know. You think I don't know? I know. There is just so much pavement pounding in this game, or sand pounding or grass pounding, whatever the case may be. You spend a lot of time hoofing it from one place to another. Specifically, you run through the plains north of your village and the path to the south about 1,000,000 times, one of which is essentially a hallway, and the other is a flat open area with a few directions to take. There is a fast travel system, but it's so inconsistent and inconvenient, it's rarely useful. Funny enough, Automata did fix all of this. Yes, you run through the city ruins 1,000,000 times, but for one, the environment changes after a certain point, and for two, the ruins are actually interesting to traverse. There are multiple distinct routes to take from one place to another, and there are interesting verticality elements and minor obstacles that gamify the act of traveling through the area. Gaps to cross, buildings to go around or over, giant pits to circumvent. Replicant has this one series of ladders and scaffolding for this bridge, which you climb in the exact same way every single time. Oh, and the fast travel is light years better in Automata, and it still has an in-universe explanation just like the ferry. Automata just has more fast travel points. I know that dropping a vending machine is easier than pathing a river, but I'm not looking for a perfectly geographically consistent map here. I'm just tired of having to leave the village, cross the plains, and climb this damn ladder to get my weapons upgraded, and I don't even have the materials. Then there's stuff like word edits. I'm sure they could have come up with a clunkier system if they tried, but probably not by much. The name alone is so counterintuitive. A word edit does not make me think of improving my weapons or magic. It makes me think of submitting a document for review. But actually using this system is even stranger. You acquire these words seemingly at random, but also seemingly like there's some arcane progression you're just not privy to. When you first receive the word, the game tells you what it does. It can apply to a weapon, a spell, or you. Sometimes it applies to multiple and has different effects for each. Most of the time it only applies to one. And the only way to figure out what a word does afterward, if you don't memorize all of them, is to just apply it to a weapon, spell, whatever, and see which stat it changes. And yes, Automata did better with this as well. Installing chips makes more sense conceptually, and everything was easier to understand, though the menu for it is still a bit clunky. Then there are the missions featured in both games. Replicant has way too many MMORPG-ish quests. Go collect these things, go talk to this guy, go collect this thing from this guy, and go find something else for him. It's mind-numbing. Automata had some of this, but it was mostly in the side quests, and in those cases, the character moments would usually make up for the gameplay. Oh, and the side quests in this game, forget them. I gave up on those after a while. They're mostly very forgettable. Surely you're seeing a pattern here. I often felt while playing NieR Replicant that it was like a prototype to what Automata would ultimately be. And not just in the way it plays, but also in its themes and structure. I remember before this game came out, I was poring over the subreddit to see what people were saying about the original. And I saw some people saying that they thought NieR was... Hey, what's happening? What? No! Not this! Anything but this! This game's structure has some serious issues. You can see it right at the beginning. You have this really interesting setup with NieR and Yona trying to survive the aftermath of the last game, and right at the height of tension, that whole scenario gets yeeted out of existence because we skip forward an incomprehensible amount of time. This would be fine if we revisited it in any meaningful way, especially since it does in fact tie in with the rest of the game, but that tie-in is mostly left to inference. I think maybe this prologue is briefly expanded once way later in the game. The game really wants you to feel for basically every character in the story, and these two are no exception. And yet, this random Shade and his robot friend get way more development than our main antagonists, who are essentially a reflection of the protagonists. Same for this asshat with the red bag and his wife. Boy, they sure are annoying, but the game pointed it out, so it's good now, right? There are just so many examples of something that's lingered on for too long, something that's not very well executed, or something that should have just been avoided in the first place. And what makes it all worse is that some parts are great. Most of the large-scale fights feel very grand and cinematic, and some of the later ones really play on the trope of the heroes blindly dispatching anything in their path without pause. There's also the part of the game where you have this isometric perspective shift that gives the game a really different feel. It's just a shame that it drags on. For every fun moment or heart-pounding battle in the game, there are many dull, repetitive, or annoying moments.
I said I'm hungry!
So how do you improve on something that's at times dull, repetitive, and annoying? Run it again! 2 times! And just add more dialogue and cutscenes into the other runs. This is something Automata did in its second route, and while I enjoyed that part to a degree, it's my least favorite part because it mostly retreads the first route. Replicant straight up has you replay the second half of the game twice. A lot of the new scenes they add are devoted to developing the shades, and I was just not feeling most of it. I don't care for the way they vocalized the shades. It's grating. I can't relate it to the sound any man or beast makes, thus making it way harder for me to care what the character is dealing with. And the whole gimmick of withholding their dialogue during the first route is just such a drag when replaying the game itself is so tedious. And beyond that, most of the Shade's new storylines are overly drawn out, especially the girl in the shipwreck. Hers was probably the most compelling, but it was just overexposed and over-explained. And while Yoko Taro's writing is typically pretty good, there are a few moments where he goes full Kingdom Hearts, and that's just not something you want to see.
You hear me? I'll chase you till the end of time, and I'll bring you back to us.
You just met these people. Not to mention the shade that lives inside Kaine, who reminds me of a bad Stephen King character. Overall, the subsequent playthroughs do little to justify the game's artificially extended playtime. And my younger, naive self thought, well, surely the new endings are gonna blow my socks off and make everything come together. And I was mostly wrong.
Hey, sunshine. I ain't certain girls, but I think your heart is involved. The hate is gone. The sadness is gone. It's just a bunch of white light.
Now, right about in this time, I started getting a little bit of a headache.
Zooming out to the larger picture, this game wrestles with pretty similar themes to Automata, but due to all the things I've been outlining, the execution is pretty lackluster in comparison. NieR and friends are heedlessly slaughtering shades, oblivious to the fact that the shades are the wandering souls of what was once human. So the game prompts you to question who is even on the right side in all of it. But by the end of the first playthrough, you basically get it. And then you have to play through twice more, and the game just keeps laying it on thicker and thicker. You're refighting the same enemies, and the game is telling you that it's bad. Boy, I can't wait to get to the end of this to see a different cutscene, and then play it over again for another cutscene. But there is a new addition in this remaster, a new secret ending that really surprised me. The developers did something with this new ending that was both gratifying and frustrating. They added a new playable character, but restricted this character to one sequence buried so far into this game I may not have reached it if I weren't making a video about it. This is a major spoiler, so if you really don't want to know, skip ahead to here. But ending E is fucking great. Having played Automata, I assumed I'd play as Kaine at some point in this game, but apparently the original NieR didn't have this feature, and the remake only includes a playable Kaine after you've played through the game 3 times. They developed an entirely new moveset for her. She's got different combat animations, special melee moves, different running animations. They did not skimp on her playable version. Plus, there are new enemies, a new area, and lots of satisfying narrative and gameplay moments in this final section. It's genuinely an awesome experience. But my god, getting this far in the game just took so long. And the real kicker is that after you finish this section, you cannot play as Kaine again unless you finish your third run again, play another new game for a couple hours, and trigger ending E again. Why put in that much effort and not allow you to play as Kaine in some form in other parts of the game? I would consider actually playing some more if that were the case. But while we're on the subject of Kaine, I have to say that while she is one of the most compelling characters in the game, if a little crass, her outfit is just too out of place and it often took me out of her dramatic scenes. I can only suspend my disbelief so far. I feel like there's a lot more specific stuff I could sit here and complain about, but suffice it to say the game has problems executing its ideas. Honestly, if I had to make one big sweeping change, it would be condensing this thing down to one playthrough. I think you could pull off all the tricks and story beats in a more effective, less time-consuming way than what we ended up with if you just bring it down to one playthrough. Maybe if the gameplay was more fun and varied, I wouldn't have minded having to replay it, but that just wasn't the case. I think playing through this game once is fairly enjoyable. After that, it really starts to drag. You could watch some highlights and subsequent endings online and you really wouldn't miss much, I feel. The only trouble is ending E. It's really fun, but I don't know if it's worth it. I am sincerely glad that Taro followed this up with Automata, and I hope whatever big project he puts out next is not as tedious as this was. It really is a fun first playthrough, so I would recommend it on that basis. And if you have a lot of patience, you can try to push through to the end. Me? I'm kinda stuck here, so guess I'll just wait, see what happens.
Follow me, oh, you make you the